So, for my reflection today, I wanted to talk about the intersection of post-positivism with objectivist ontology. Positivism, of course, had a very strict objectivist ontology. There is an objective reality that exists, and we discover that objective reality through data and measurements. And then through those data and measurements, we can then extrapolate to predict what might happen in the future. Obviously, positivism had a lot of limitations, and that strictness didn't really allow it to develop. And so, obviously, post-positivism was a necessary development. And there are a lot of things that I really agree with. For example, the development of mixed methods research and the validity of qualitative data, the admission of uncertainty in data collection and in theorizing. And of course, acknowledging the subjectivity of the researcher and the possible impact that that might play on the research process. I was initially under the impression that the ontological framework switched completely from positivism to post-positivism because obviously positivism was overly extreme in its objectivity. And then I assumed that post-positivism as a reaction to that would be very subjectivist. And I do think that a lot of our materials give that implication. But after reading through some of the supplemental materials and then doing my own research, I discovered that post-positivism is more ontologically pluralistic. And when I was kind of going through my own personal reflection, the way that I started to integrate these two frameworks, meaning my objectivist ontological framework and the post-positivist epistemological methodological framework, I integrated them through phenomenology. Phenomenology is a philosophical discipline developed in the early part of the 20th century, and it didn't concern itself so much with the reality of a thing itself. Rather, it concerned itself with our experienced phenomena of that thing. So you could say that this plate is a physical object that does exist, but if I experience it as a frisbee, then I will interact with it as if it is a frisbee. For example, I might say that womanhood is something that objectively exists, but you and I don't interact with womanhood as an objective reality. Instead, we interact with our subjective understanding and experiences of what we believe womanhood to be. Phenomenology itself is more ontologically flexible because it allows for the existence of an objective reality without necessarily concerning itself with it. At least that's how it was sort of originally formulated by Husserl, Stein, Heidegger. More modern phenomenological developments I should definitely do my reading on. But personally, I was really influenced by Edith Stein, who, is one of my philosophical heroes. She did a lot of really great work on the phenomenological experience of empathy and relationality, which could be really applicable, for example, to social justice concepts or to research involving marginalized groups or individuals. And I was pleased to see in the supplemental readings that a phenomenological approach was actually advocated by Holliday and MacDonald as a way for a researcher to interrogate their own subjectivity. I think the integration of a phenomenological approach does allow for the coexistence of an objectivist ontological framework with a post-positivist epistemological methodological framework. And I also want to talk briefly about the applications of an objective ontology to social justice. So we see multiple definitions of social justice throughout the readings, and I think that this is an example of Thomas Kuhn's sort of prophetic notion that science would kind of bifurcate and fragment with different people following different paradigms because they don't necessarily know which background beliefs to discard in their approach, but that does make it really hard to pursue a unified objective. For example, one of the definitions in our textbook, which acknowledges multiple definitions of social justice, makes reference to the pursuit of a social contract. But the social contract is likely different for different societies. Therefore, social justice would be completely different in, say, Uzbekistan and America. Some researchers, such as Elizabeth Anderson, see it more as relational equality and the abolition of oppression. And then several other sources link it with the equitable distribution of resources. In the chosen article by Kreider, he really pushes back against this concept, and he bases this critique off of economic philosophers such as Friedrich Hayek. Those critiques largely boil down to the idea that the state can never perfectly understand all of the motives and needs of the people in a society, and so any state-enforced redistribution of resources would lead to serious economic inefficiencies. And historically, we see that these economic inefficiencies are filled either by black markets or widespread corruption. I personally have a bachelor's degree in economics, and I really focused on economic philosophy and economic development, and I strongly agree with these critiques. You could argue that the redistribution of resources maybe shouldn't be state enforced. Maybe it should be a wellspring of the people and sort of a bottom-up approach. And again, through my study of economic philosophy, I'll say that there are examples where we do see this working, but all of those examples are largely small scale in a group of people that is ideologically homogenous. And so I don't think that I can in good conscience subscribe to those definitions of social justice either, because I don't think that they're economically realistic. Kreider himself, who's writing to a libertarian audience that's largely skeptical of social justice, comes at it from the approach that social justice stems from the dignity of the human person. And I would largely agree with that. But I think this fragmentation of definitions, again, calls for a more objectivist ontological framework. I think that the word justice itself implies the existence of a moral standard that can be transgressed. And if two parties have different moral standards that are equally valid, then what is perceived as justice by one could easily be perceived as injustice by another. You might counter that by saying that justice is about fairness and equity. And I would say that fairness itself is also a subjective concept. So I guess the crux of this reflection is I strongly hold my objectivist ontological framework. And I do believe that it's possible to explore and engage with these concepts using that framework, especially with the practice of phenomenological bracketing. I completely welcome your thoughts and critiques of this. All of my references are here.